Hello there, dear listener. We hope you're enjoying this lovely discussion. If you're not already aware, this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio, a Pan-African nationalist and Garveyite network committed to showcasing the rich and varied thoughts of African people. We have an exciting lineup of shows that we think you'll enjoy, including
the Bitter Medicine Podcast.
I think black people acquire too much buy-in. Like, we constantly have to sell black people on things that are beneficial to black people.
The Pro-Black Perspective Podcast.
I'm fearful that our people are not really studying how to get ahead, and we're kind of, continually staying behind.
The Harsh Reality Podcast.
To me, it don't matter. I think people are so dumbed down, it wouldn't matter what you reveal to them. They still are in the matrix. They're in the simulation. They're going to keep doing what they did. They lemmings. So to me, it don't matter, man.
The Learning Curve Podcast.
Sexual access has never given you economic empowerment. The only person who has ever been economically empowered by a sexual relationship is the wasp and his woman.
The Cathedra Cheek Show.
When we start rising up to fight for our own, I guarantee you they'll stop doing what they're doing. I guarantee you they would have let their brother go. They was waiting to see what black folks was going to do.
Brother Bakari Podcast.
Black people love to claim folks that hate them, right? They're a slave master, and they are ashamed of who they really are.
The Forecast Radio.
Like, if you pray to the same deity as, like, your enemy, and that God blesses your enemy more than you may want to reconsider who you praying to,
And Tanzan, African Mind.
Africans generally are welcoming of everyone. Sometimes, to my consternation, I think that they should be less, welcoming.
If you love our podcast network, we would be grateful if you could rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on social media, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and check out our website at www.kwazradio.com for more information. Thank you for tuning in. And now, back to the program.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thank you for hanging out with me today. I appreciate each and every one of you. I have been reading Once Upon a Time When We Were Colored by request. The author is Clifton L. Talbert, and we're on chapter 2. This book can be found at the Internet Archive at archive.org if you want to read along with us. I just want to thank you all for hanging in there with me. It's been a tough road, a tough journey, and I have just been trying to get back into the groove of things. But before we continue, I want to say, every single thing that touches your life, whether it is religious, social, or political, must be an instrument of your liberation, or you must throw it into the ash can of history. Now remember, I will make enunciation mistakes. From time to time, I will give you my opinion about the information that we're reading. And if you ever ask, I will always share my source. Chapter 2, Long Brown Stockings and Colored Debutantes. Mama and I left Papa's house early on that Monday morning because we both had to walk to Peru School, the plantation school where she taught. It was a long, hot walk with no chance for a ride because there weren't many cars in the colored section. I was not yet 5 years old and more of a burden than a blessing. But Mama had nowhere to leave me because all my aunts were field workers during the day. So I went with her every day, and sat in the back of the old plantation church, which served as the schoolhouse. There weren't many colored plantation schoolhouses left by the time I was born. Prior to my birth, during my mother's maturing years and those of her parents, one-room school plantations were the primary source of education for colored children growing up in and around small southern towns. Even though Mama had barely graduated from high school at the time, she was considered a capable teacher. In spite of her lack of college training, Mama was creative and concerned. It didn't matter much to her that the Peru school was miles from her house and that she had to teach all 8 grades in one room. She was dedicated to her students, and her students, many close in age to her, called her Miss Mary. Mama especially enjoyed teaching in the spring when the old unpainted colored Baptist church would be surrounded by green meadows and deep ravines with ropes and ropes of long green vines. The springtime also made our long walk easier. Mama always sought ways to get her students' parents involved. For instance, the parents took turns bringing and serving the school lunch. Everyone at the school was poor except the Crockett children. Their father was the colored overseer at the plantation. The rest of the sharecropping and tenant families had very little money, so when my mother asked that they assist in providing and serving food, she made it clear that they could bring whatever they had, and they did that. Each day, there were a variation of beans, peas, and cornbread, or peas, okra, beans, and cornbread. The food was plain but hot and tasty. It was free, and it was much better than the previous school lunch, which had none. The ladies would get permission to leave the fields a little early while Mama was teaching. They'd be getting the old iron stove hot. These field hands turned volunteer cooks would heat the beans to the stove and turn one of the long church benches into a table to serve the hot meal. For nearly a year, I walked to Peru school with my mother and watched her try to bring education to young people who were being raised to be plantation workers in a society where planting and harvesting of cotton took precedence over the cultivation of mines. I'll add a note right here. Not much has changed. They still try to dumb our children down. Even though the plantation schools were ill-equipped and little was provided to facilitate education, I always enjoyed watching my mother take the ordinary and make something special. For instance, Mama would get all the farm families involved in creating the annual Peru School Christmas pageant. One year, with the help of a few faithful parents, Mama turned the altar area of the church into Bethlehem. Dried cotton stalks became stubble for the manger floor, and hand-cut logs made up the exposed beams that framed the stable. Sheets of multicolored quilts formed the walls of a Jewish inn, and the children of tired field hands became angels, shepherds, and kings. The families crowded into the one-room building, their greased faces shining as they watched their children perform. I remember parents crying as the children recited their lines by memory. The entire audience joined in as Doris Crockett, one of the angels, led them in singing Silent Night. As the years went by and minor incidents of progress came our way, the plantation schools would pass away, and the separate but equal policy would be established, paving the way for the central colored schools that served not only the small towns of their location, but also the surrounding plantations. Finally, it was time to start my education at the colored school in Glen Allen. I wasn't 6, but I had been given permission to start school early. Miss Maxey was the teacher, the principal, and the disciplinarian. She was also a good friend of my mother, Ma Ponk, and Mama Pearl. I was excited. My mother was overjoyed, and Ma Pearl was determined that her great-grandson would start his first day warmly dressed and supplied with adequate food. The fall school term always coincided with the time between the end of cotton chopping season and the start of cotton picking season. This brief pause gave the parents a chance to buy winter clothes and get their children ready for school. For those children whose parents were tenant farmers or sharecroppers, their school cycle revolved around the needs of the farms or plantations. I was fortunate that my folks were not sharecroppers. We lived in town, which gave me full opportunity to go to school. Getting an education was a priority in our house. After all, Papa, Elder Young, was a well-known Baptist preacher. On that long-awaited September day, I got up early. I didn't want to be late, and I wanted to walk with all the other children. Papa was already up having his coffee, and Mama Pearl, as usual, was busy as a colored bee in her kitchen. A new day, a first day, and new clothes. School was going to be fun. As I was getting up, I looked around, but I couldn't find my new clothes. Mama Pearl, where's my clothes? Boy, don't be so hurried. Come on out here on the sun porch and eat your breakfast. I laid your clothes on the bed in your room. I put my plaid robe over the pajamas which Mama Pearl made me wear summer and winter, and went out to have breakfast with Papa. Papa was a great preacher, but he was not much at talking while eating. And I was so excited about school that I just ate a few mouthfuls of grits and cured ham before I ran into the small bedroom to get dressed. There, laid out on the big brass bed, were my new school clothes. I stood motionless, looking at them, stunned and embarrassed. Next to my new blue jeans lay two awful pieces of clothing, a pair of ugly, brown, knee-high stockings, and a suit of white flannel long johns. Determined to keep me warm, Mama Pearl had also bought me a new pair of high-topped shoes. Even at the tender age of 5, I knew everyone would laugh at me in these clothes. I would be the only kid dressed head to toe by a great-grandmother who cared nothing about the boxer shorts, short socks, and low-quartered shoes all the other children would be wearing. Embarrassed, but determined to live through it, I dressed and waited for Mama Pearl to fix my lunch. We lived only 4 houses from the school, but it was against the rules for students to come home for lunch. While she was in the kitchen, I went out on the porch where I hurriedly rolled my long johns up to my knees and my brown stockings down into the sides of my high-top shoes. I was determined not to be laughed at out of school with my long johns and my brown stockings showing. I could hear them coming down the gravel road, all my friends and cousins, laughing and talking, and I could hardly wait to join the big kids on my way to school. I started for the door, but I was intercepted by Mama Pearl. She came out of the kitchen and handed me my lunch. Then she placed a green corduroy cap on my head, pulled the flaps down over my ears, and buckled the straps securely under my chin. She gave me a long list of don'ts. Don't sass Miss May Maxey. Don't leave the school ground. Don't be cutting up at your seat. And come straight home after school is out. Yes'm, I replied to each one, but I knew that all her don'ts would turn out to be my friend's do's. Towering over me, Mama Pearl was a big woman with red hair and freckles, kept giving me instructions as my friends called me to join them. While I stood there under the iron finger of love, I looked into the streets at the other boys. Unlike me, they wore no caps. They all had low-quartered tennis shoes, and they were throwing rocks and hitting dogs. I almost wished they'd leave me and let me walk alone, but no such luck. Instead, Mama Pearl raised her voice high enough to let them hear her list the don'ts as they waited for me in the street. At last she finished and I was free to join them. Having gotten my head covered, my molasses bucket filled with food, and my body wrapped in long johns and stockings, Mama Pearl was satisfied that I would not get pleurisy and that I was ready to learn. She stood on the top step, hands on her hips, determined not to move until I was out of eyesight. As we passed Miss Martha Clinton's place and Mr. George Stanley's shotgun house, I could relax and join the group. I was now out of Mama Pearl's range. Suddenly, all of the boys wanted to see what was in my Brer Rabbit molasses lunch bucket. The bigger boys jerked on my bucket as I held onto it and tried to run. By the time they finished jerking and I finished running, my flapjacks, molasses, and salt meat strips were mangled together. The bigger boys didn't seem to mind, however. They opened my bucket quickly and ate my food. I arrived at school carrying an empty bucket. When lunchtime came, I was hungry. I cried to go home, and Miss Maxie gave me permission. With tears streaming down my colored face, I ran as fast as I could to Mama Pearl and explained how I lost my food. She wouldn't have me crying. Now, come on, boy, in this house. Them no good boys. I'm subject to tell their mamas. She made me sit on the front porch and she fixed me a hot meal and made everything right. She reminded me as I was finishing my lunch that good little boys didn't fight because vengeance belonged to God. I'm going to stop you right there. That Christianity is self-harm ideology, because at the end of the day, you need to be able to stand up for yourself. Great, I thought, but God never showed up at school to help me out. I spent almost a year sitting at my wooden desk in the one-room schoolhouse where Miss Maxie taught all 8 grades. Next door, we could see the new brick colored school under construction and the men digging away the mounds of dirt for the cesspool. Toward the end of spring, the entire colored community looked forward to the 8th grade graduation exercises. For the colored students in Glen Allen, completing the 8th grade was equal to earning a high school diploma. Many of these students came from tenant farmer and sharecropper families for whom all having a son or daughter graduate the 8th grade was a major accomplishment. In some instances, colored kids who lived on farms had to board in Glen Allen to avail themselves of that educational opportunity. One such boarder I'll always remember was Bernice, my cousin from the colony, who came to Glen Allen to live with T and complete the 8th grade. T was short for Auntie. She was the town supplier of eggs, butter, and milk, with quite a reputation for being a business lady. Bernice had been raised by cousin Lulu Harris, a well-known church worker and landowner in the colony. Cousin Lulu believed in an education, and no expense was too great or sacrifice too difficult to keep her from giving Bernice the best. There was no school in the colony and no buses were running, so she rented a room from T so Bernice could pursue her schooling. Bernice did complete the 8th grade and this gave her the opportunity to participate in the one great social cultural event, prom. On prom night each year, the 8th grade colored girls were our debutantes. This spring, during the 1950s, Bernice would graduate and cousin Lulu would sacrifice and buy her the floor-length taffeta and fishnet gown which the occasion required. I must have gone to T's house to buy fresh buttermilk for Mama. Mama always bought fresh milk, butter, and eggs from T. Even though T and Uncle Perry lived in town, their property was big enough to fence in an area for their cows and chickens. While I was at T's, Cousin Lulu came into town with Bernice's gown. Long gowns weren't seen every day, and this dress was beautiful. T raved about it, and Bernice beamed as she pranced in front of the mirror with the new gown held up to her. I stood on the sidelines and watched these two older colored women share the excitement with Bernice and helped her get ready for her big night. Everybody in Glen Allen knew when the prom was, and when prom night happened, everybody would be watching, sitting on their front porches so they could see the young ladies and gentlemen walk by, perhaps hear the comments and compliments of the neighbors. I joined Ma Punk on the front porch, the garret, as she called it, and waited to see the start of prom. It was easy for us to see because her house was just north of the colored school grounds. The school grounds were immaculate, and all the teachers would be present wearing their gowns and suits that had served them well at their colored college alma maters. There she is. There's Bernice. I saw Bernice as the girls and their dates began to arrive. The girls arranged themselves on one side of the lawn with their gowns spread out as they gently knelt on the grass. The boys in their suits, and awkward to these once every year social graces, stood on the opposite side. With the deep green grass as their backdrop, with their gowns spread out in full circles around them, the girls looked like a living bouquet of colored flowers, waiting to be picked by the anxious boys. As the girl's name was called, a boy would walk over, hold out his hand, and she would stand to full height while he pinned a corsage on her dress. Together, they would walk into the school, where the colored band would be playing the blues. As I would later learn, they spent the best part of the night dancing, slow dragging, as it was called. For those few hours, the 8th grade prom transformed our colored community of sharecroppers and hired hands into a society of gentlemen and debutantes. It was years before it would be my time to attend prom, and in the meantime, I watched as our first colored brick school was built. The new Glen Allen Colored School was the result of the separate but equal policies. Many lives had passed through the one-room schoolhouse. Now a long concrete walk to the new school from the little wood frame white building was our only link to a vanishing past. I spent my first year in the new schoolhouse awed by the tall ceiling and our first floor indoor toilets. Going to the toilet was a grand affair. With our teacher leading, we all lined up and waited our turn to use the urinals. We were not familiar with the handles that would let water into the long steel bowl. Each day we were told how to use the toilets and keep in mind that they were not outhouses. It took a while, but we eventually remembered to flush. The Glen Allen Colored School taught us more than how to flush toilets. It was our social life. As a young colored boy, I would learn about teenage romance at the colored school, for it was here we younger children surreptitiously watched, like the Essie Short and Mac Cheney falling in love. Mac Cheney was my mother's younger brother and was known as a good-looking colored boy. He was considered a good catch. Essie Short was one of the many daughters of Lily Short who lived on Linden Plantation. Even though the principal, Mr. Moore, and his teachers tried to keep young romance under control at school, they were no match for the wiles of Essie and Mac, as they found any excuse to be together. The corner of the schoolhouse was their favorite place, and they probably never knew that all us younger boys would sneak around behind the cafeteria and watch them steal kisses while they were hoping to not be caught by Miss Maxey. The school also provided a forum for Miss Ross to indoctrinate us into the world of 4-H and teach us the importance of not saying ain't. And it did more. The red brick schoolhouse had 8 separate rooms with a focal point of pride for the colored community. The vehicle that would make our lives better. Even though we were being educated by colored teachers who in many instances came from backgrounds as deprived as our own, we were always motivated to be the best colored people. Our teachers made sure we knew the life histories of George Washington Carver, Mary McLeod Bethune, Marian Anderson, and Jackie Robinson. We were encouraged to learn to write and read about their lives. Over and over again, as we progressed through grades 1 through 8, these 4 great colored Americans were the subjects of countless essays. I would be out of college before I could fully realize that these 4 people, though they were great trailblazers, by no means represented the sum total of colored achievements. By the time I reached the 8th grade, I knew the lives of the Big 4 by memory. I had learned that chocolate milk did not come from colored cows, and most importantly, I learned the value of flushing the commode. I knew Columbus discovered America and that Mr. Stennis and Miss Eastland represented the state of Mississippi in the Congress of the United States. I knew little or nothing about my African heritage or of the great contributions made to American history by many notable coloreds. I knew not to say ain't, and I knew I wanted to be somebody. I was now ready to graduate. Side note, with the things that he knew and the things that he knew that he didn't know very much. But they did the best they could, and perhaps they instilled a sense of pride, community, and moral turpitude in these people as they were progressing through this 1 through 8 school building. In 1959, when I graduated from the 8th grade, mine was among the last classes to follow the tradition of the 8th grade baccalaureate and commencement, which still entailed the traditional prom carried out in cotillion style. Our class was also among the last to feel the need to invite sympathetic white leaders to observe our rite of passage from unlearned field hands to young people with potential and purpose. As I sat among the 1959 8th grade graduates, I listened quietly to the principal, Mr. Moore, when he introduced my own papa, Elder Jan. Papa quietly charged us to not cause trouble, to be diligent in our work, and to go as far as we could. With the graduation over and the summer following close behind, I would prepare for my usual season of chopping cotton. But with great anticipation of the fall school year, I would be going to O'Bannon High School in Greenville. So excited I was going to go to the big city, I hardly took notice of the fact that the white high school of Glen Allen was only blocks from my house, and that I would have to travel more than 100 miles round trip each day to the colored high school in Greenville. Miss Ross, Miss Maxey, and the other colored teachers had convinced us that no obstacle should stand in the way of our goals. Remember the lives of Carver, Bethune, Anderson, and Robinson. Chapter 3. Colored people just passing time. Most of the colored people in Glen Allen, Mississippi spent their lives working hard and never quite reaching their goals. What's changed today? But year after year, in spite of past failures, when crops were bad and end of season bills amounted to more than a people made, they persisted, working as maids 7 days a week or sharecropping, picking cotton by day in the fall and chopping cotton by day during the summer was their way of life. There was a strong work ethic when I was growing up in the South. Every colored person worked from the time he was old enough to drag a sack through the cotton fields. The work was backbreaking, exhausting, and sometimes degrading. It quite often required a mother to leave home in the morning to go prepare breakfast for a white family before her own children were fed. Everybody worked because, in spite of everything, most of the older people still clung fast to the belief that if you worked hard, you would get a slice of the American dream. I wonder if they would feel that way today, because what we know is that there are unfair advantages given to some, and there are many more that are just denied opportunity. Continuing. Never having been much never having been given much medical attention, their bodies showed signs of wear early, and their youthful agility quickly gave way to the aches and pains of age. Even though the people's time was orchestrated by the demands of the cotton fields, however, there were those precious rare moments when they would get together just to pass the time. Ma Punk always worked hard, as did the others, only allowing herself to rest half days on Saturday, all day on Sunday, and during those seasons between planting and harvesting cotton. Even though her feet gave her tremendous pain and her back ached more with each passing year, she never gave in to her ailments. She continued to pick and chop cotton. On Saturday mornings, however, she allowed herself the time to pursue one of her favorite pastimes, fishing on Lake Washington. Yet even her fishing was approached with zeal. On those Saturdays, I'd reluctantly join her and her 3 friends. To them, fishing was not only a chance to supplement their food supply, it was a social event and an opportunity to gossip. Ma Punk, Miss Doll, Miss Henrietta, and Cousin Beauty formed the foursome that walked from the back of Glen Allen past the uptown to Lake Washington, where they staked out the best fishing spots. Most of the time, they caught buckets of fish, but if by chance their luck ran afoul, it would never be their fault. They blamed the water on being too hot or cold, or they said the fish had gone downstream or upstream, whatever was more convenient. I recall the day, after years of failure, that I caught my first and only 3 fish. I didn't really want to go fishing that day, but I didn't have much choice. I never wanted to go fishing, but Ma Punk would not leave me at home alone. I trailed behind the 4 ladies trying to pretend I wasn't with them, but close enough for Ma Punk to feel comfortable that I wouldn't get into trouble. I knew that if I lagged too far behind, Ma Punk's yells for me would catch up clearly. Ma Punk's yells for me to catch up quickly would align me with them. Early on, I had carried my own pole, but for some reason, my catgut string always tangled beyond repair, and Ma Punk, tired of untangling my line. The other ladies were convinced that I tangled the line on purpose. I disliked the idea of gathering the worms with even more than I disliked the fishing. Ma Punk insisted on growing her own worms behind the rundown chicken house. Reluctantly, I would dig for those long, slimy baits, as we call them, and put them along the moist soil into a quart fruit jar. I dug them from the dark, damp side of the chicken coop, which never saw much sun and stayed wet from the dripping water. Each morning, after our traditional breakfast of hoe cakes, sausages, and hot coffee, I would religiously take the coffee grounds and spread them beside the chicken coop. Ma Pong believed that the grounds added to the fertility of the bait habitat. The wet soil, along with the constant exposure to used coffee grounds, must have worked. The bits were plentiful, long, and fat, and according to Ma Pong, just right, right enough to cover the hook, and plenty left to dangle into the water. On Saturday morning, I prepared the bucket, the fruit jar of bait, and got the poles down to the side of the house, while Ma Punk was busy getting dressed in her fishing gear, making sure she had an ample supply of Garrett snuff. From Ma Punk's house to the lake would normally be a short distance, but we had to make 3 additional stops, which lengthened the trip. We stopped by Miss Dahl's house first. She was almost ready, but she had to finish getting Mr. Jim's breakfast. He sat on the front porch dressed in khaki pants, black suspenders, and a white t-shirt, fanning away the heat. Mr. Jim was one of those almost white colored men whose skin would burn from the intense southern sun, so he always fanned the heat away. According to Ma Punk, Dow waited on him hand and foot. Dow, ain't you ready yet? Ma Punk called back into her kitchen. Now, Punk, you know Jim can't get around good. Let me put a little peach jelly on his biscuit, pour his coffee, and get his food to him. Jim, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Get up and help yourself, man. Ma Punk laughed as Miss Dow set up the little table on the porch for Mr. Jim. I watched as Miss Dow made sure her husband was settled and had all the food he needed. In the meantime, Ma Punk gathered our fishing poles, the bait jar, and the water bucket. Together, we stood by Miss Doll's front gate, anxiously waiting for her to get her gear. Assured that Mr. Jim had plenty of food, Miss Doll, who was dressed except for her hat, went around to the back of their house and got her poles. Jim, leave them dishes right there on the table. I'll take care of them when I get back. Jim was busy eating with one hand and fanning with the other, nodded as the 3 of us closed the big gate and headed uptown to pick up Miss Henrietta and Cousin Beauty. Miss Doll, and Ma Punk walked ahead of me, catching up on the latest gossip. As usual, I walked slowly behind, wishing I could have stayed home or been left at Cousin Savannah's to play with her grandson, Bobby. Ma Punk would stop off at Savannah's for a few minutes to talk, but on fishing days, she would never let me stay and play. Ma Punk would also stop and chat with her sister-in-law, Miss Callie, who lived next door to Savannah, and inquire about Callie's husband, Mr. Perry, after which we continued our slow walk. By the time we got to Miss Florence's house, we could see Miss Henrietta and Cousin Beauty standing alongside the road with poles in hand, dressed and ready to go. Like Miss Doll and Ma Punk, they had their heads covered with wide straw hats, wore long-sleeve shirts, and their everyday dresses. The 4 ladies with armloads of fishing gear took up most of the narrow road as they passed the post office to find their favorite fishing spots. Each one had a lucky spot. They were close enough to each other to continue talking, but far enough apart to keep their lines from tangling. I sat on the bank of the lake with my feet dangling in the water as the 4 ladies joked, laughed, and spit snuff. Miss Dow kept them laughing about Mr. Jim and his helplessness, while Miss Henrietta talked on and on about Mr. Will and all the people that came over to get a haircut without their 2 bits. Ma Punk laughed and joked with them, but she wasn't one to give out much information, and Cousin Beauty was there to fish. She volunteered a bit of news about what happened Friday night at James Gatson's cafe. I was too young to visit James's cafe after dark, but even then, I knew it was the right spot to be in. All the northern cousins, which would include James' place, on their itinerary during visits to Glen Allen. His jukebox and the food he served there were in a class by themselves. James was a big man, dark complected, with a flashing smile, and he had a pretty young wife named Luella. Though located in the heart of the colored section in a small southern town, his cafe had an interior decor that allowed it to not be classified as a juke joint. Cousin Beauty was a short order cook at James's place on Friday and Saturday nights and had the reputation for being his best cook. But today she was concentrating her energies on catching catfish. I was getting more tired and bored by the minute. It seemed as if I had fished all my life, but I never ever caught one fish. Ma Punk always kept me close to her so she could let me know when I had a bite. Ma Punk's eyes were sharp, and she watched both lines with great accuracy. I am glad she was watching that day because otherwise I would have missed my fish. Boy, watch what you're doing. You got a bite, yelled Ma Punk. With lightning quick action, she grabbed my poles and together we pulled in my first white perch. I was amazed. With one fish under my belt, I paid more attention to fishing. And much to everybody's surprise, I caught 2 more fish, more than I had ever caught in my life. It was a good Saturday morning. Most of the time, the fish that were caught were cooked for dinner or supper. Occasionally, however, the fish became part of a fun-filled and festive Sunday afternoon. During those rare get-togethers, Ma Punk would turn her house and yard into a park, and she and her friends would start early in the afternoon to get the fire hot. They would get the black iron skillets red hot and the grease would pop all over the place. There would be loaves and loaves of Wonder Bread and number 3 tubs would be filled with cold Pabst beer and Jack's beer. Ma Punk's long front porch was turned into a stage where the local musicians would come to play and sing the blues, and her small front yard was soon filled with colored people. They came from the colored colony, from Peru Plantation, from Wildwood, Grace, Valewood, and the backfield of Greenfield. They walked, they rode in the backs of pickup trucks, they hitchhiked, and they came down from down the road. Field hands, maids, school teachers, church deacons, and even the old folk, they were all there. Some were dressed in their Sunday best while others wore their work clothes. Lost in the atmosphere of fun and frivolity, they joked, they laughed, they hugged and kissed each other as they ate fried fish, drank beer, and lost themselves in the blues. Side note, we have lost that sense of community where as a people we came together, whether you were the doctor, the lawyer, the janitor, the teacher, the nurse, the maid. We don't come together and do those things anymore. And that's one of the things that integration took away from us. It's one of the reasons why integration is a trap, because it disconnects you from the people that you have the most support from. Continuing. I was too little to really appreciate those wonderful musicians, but I remember their faces and I can still hear their voices ringing out as the then unknown Muddy Waters, who came from a nearby plantation, turned his guitar and loaned his deep, soulful voice to their melodies of hurt, cheating love, and those you done me wrong tunes. Long-legged ladies and strong-backed colored men moved gracefully as they melted their voices together. They sang the blues with the excitement of a Sunday church service, and they all seemed lost in the soulful sound of guitars. They knew it would be Monday in the morning, but this was their time, their Sunday, and they let the blues express the life they lived. The smell of hot fish and the sound of the blues had faded, Ma Ponk's front porch was quiet now, except for the faint sound of hummingbirds going from flower to flower. And as the summertime and the fishing season passed, Ma Ponk and her friends would find new ways to spend their rare leisure time. With the fishing season over, the cotton not quite ready to pick, Ma Ponk would spend her days sorting boxes and boxes of quilting pieces, mending her broken down fence, picking pecans, and helping the neighbors kill hogs for the winter's meals. We would always kill hogs on Saturday, so the complete day would be devoted to killing, cutting, cooking, and curing the meat. The day we shot and killed our old sow was no different. Ma Punk had gotten me up early, and even though it wasn't cold, I had to dress warmly. Like Ma Pearl before her, Ma Punk's favorite subject seemed to be the importance of keeping out the chill. After eating a quick breakfast, my cousins and I gathered by the hog pen so we could see the first people arrive. As I watched the old sow wallowing in her mud puddle, I recalled how I had helped to build the pen and had dug her a water hole. Even though we had built her a safe, secure pen, she would always find a way to root and get into the neighbor's mustard green patch. Our neighbor, Aunt Mary Ann, upon discovering her garden torn apart, would immediately give us an accusing holler. By the time she got through pointing her fingers, you'd think we had purposely led the old sow into her garden. Then we'd have to get help to capture the old sow, surrounded by people, all shouting, and with large sticks in their hands, she'd grunt, squeal, and reluctantly go back to the pen. Even though she had given us many sleepless nights by rooting out of her pen, I was still somewhat sad when the second shot was fired and the last grunt heard. When it was all over and the old sow was dead, my cousins and I watched as Moses, my mother's husband, and the other men caught the sow by the hind legs and placed her big, red, hairy body over the large barrel of hot boiling water. The body was dipped again and again into the water until the hair became soft enough to be scraped away from the skin that would eventually become cracklings. I watched as the men laid the now hairless hog on a large board and began the task of cutting. Even though they weren't Ma Punk's hogs being killed, she somehow seemed to be in charge. She moved about giving orders while getting the iron pot ready to make lard. Ma Punk assisted the men in correctly cutting up the hog, making sure none of the scores of people present walked away with the good parts. So as you can see, there was a sense of community even in their food distribution processes. But you should note that we have taken away from our children that closeness to their food and to the types of food that they eat. They think that they can go to the store to pick up some food. They don't know that somebody had to kill that animal. Somebody had to raise that animal first and foremost, care for that animal, and then kill that animal and process and prepare it correctly so that it can be consumed. Nearly every part of the hog was used, down to the hooves. A small portion of the odds and ends would be shared, but most of it was kept for the family. Hams and shoulders were hung from the sides of the house to be cured, while 2 or 3 iron pots of water were set to boiling for making crackling skins, pork lard, and cleaning out the insides for chitlins. When the day was almost over and most of the people had gone home, I stayed around. I wanted to see my grandfather Julius cooking fresh pork liver over an open fire. He would fry at least half the liver, and he was known for seasoning and cooking it just right. Dressed in overalls and wearing an old felt hat with decades of sweat soaked around the band, with his pipe and matchstick in his mouth, he would hum quietly and sing as he poked the fire and watched the iron skillet get red hot. The lard made a stinging sound as it hit the bottom of the skillet. when Daddy Julius would take a handful of fresh cut liver, carefully roll it in flour, salt and pepper, and drop it into the waiting hot grease. He poked the fire and turned the liver, and all the while we would be bathing in the aroma. When it turned deliciously brown on one side, he quickly turned it over, and soon the fall air would be filled with the wonderful smell of fried hot liver. With the cooking and the eating of the liver, hog killing day ended. Now it was time to turn to other things. Ma Ponk turned her mind to quilting. While the fall days were still fairly nice and her friends could sit on the front porch and piece together their intricate designs, which would later become family heirlooms. Ma Ponk kept a quilting frame in the loft, and I usually assisted in getting it down. We would clear out the front room and hang the frame in the center, securely anchored at all four sides. With the frame in place, the ladies would attach the lining, add the matted cotton, and finally place their intricately designed top over the lining and cotton. To do this, they'd come early in the morning and stay all day, Ma Ponk and her friends, while turning multicolored scraps into treasured designs learned from their mothers and grandmothers. They would laugh, talk, discuss their children and their northern relatives. Their calloused hands swiftly and expertly sewed their feelings of love into the fabric they had salvaged and saved. Many of these handmade quilts would later be boxed and sent north as gifts and warm reminders of family left behind. After the quilts were finished, Ma Ponk would wrap them in old newspapers and tie the boxes with cord. Then, on Saturday mornings, we'd take them to the post office and mail them north. On the way uptown, we'd stop by Miss Florence's store and rest and catch up on the news. Miss Florence was from New Orleans. They said she was a Creole, but we never really knew. She and Mr. Isaiah had the only colored grocery store in Glen Allen at the time, and the only colored store that would extend credit on the strength of your word. When we were between harvesting seasons, the store was a favorite hangout for colored men. The store itself was not very large, a rather plain shotgun building built off the ground. It was shaded by an overgrown chinaberry tree that had also provided shade and comfort to the men who met there daily to chew tobacco and discuss baseball. The ground under the tree was completely bald from the many chairs and soda crates that provided seating for the old men. Inside of Miss Florence's store, it was very dark, and if it had not been for my love of donuts, I probably would not have visited many times. Nearly every time I went inside, I would see the same group of old men sitting at the far end by the meat box. These men with bloodshot eyes framed by weather-worn colored skin would be playing dominoes, not talking much, but concentrating on their strategic moves. People came in and out of the store, but the old men were so preoccupied, they never let shopping interrupt their leisure. And right there in the midst, there would be Miss Florence's husband making his moves with the guys. Occasionally, I'd hear sounds of disagreement from one or two of the men, but never any physical movement. They never moved for customers. We worked our way around them, careful not to butt up against them or step on the old gray cat who had ownership of the store. Miss Ponk, Miss Florence, and Miss Lottie Jones, the colored midwife, would talk for a while. Ma Ponk always made it a point to talk with Miss Lottie because she was among the upper class colored. She delivered just about all the colored babies, and she was known for strict recovery instructions. The new mother was not to take a bath, and her room was to be made completely dark with no hint of sunshine coming in. I was too busy eating my donut to remember much of Ma Ponk's conversations with Miss Lottie. After filling in Ma Ponk and Miss Doll on the latest births, Miss Lottie excused herself, and the two of us proceeded uptown to ensure that the quilts made it north before the winter set in. With the quilting done, the fences mended, and the baseball season over, both men and women spent much of their time listening to boxing, the sport that brought the brown bomber Joe Louis into our homes. His name inspired pride. His fights would be relived for weeks and his victories celebrated forever. The brown bomber was our hero. So few were the colored heroes that the ones we knew by name, such as Joe Louis, were like the neighbors who lived next door or down the road. A good old boy from the plantation that had gone north and made us proud. Joe Louis's fights were the subjects of sermons and sizzle for those Saturday night conversations. I don't remember the exact year, but I recall the night our front yard was filled with people who had come over to Ma Punk's to listen to the fight. It was an important fight, and everyone wanted to hear the win for themselves. There weren't many radios in the colored section, but Ma Punk had an old battery-operated one. It was important to her. She played it only on Sundays and for special occasions, and this was a special occasion. A crowd of people started gathering early, bringing their Jack's beer with them. Ma Punk placed the radio in the window and unlatched the screen. She would never let that many people in her house, but her front porch was filled to capacity, and there were grown men sitting on the ground as close to the bedroom window as possible. With their bottles of beer and laughter, these didn't appear to be the tired field hands. Their hard day's work wasn't slowing them down. Not on this night. Their hero would be fighting tonight, and Joe Louis, with his fists, quickness, and punching power, could say for them what they could never say for themselves. It was a sin to miss a Joe Louis fight. They all knew the exact time for the bell to ring, and Ma Punk knew the exact time to turn the radio on. She didn't want to run the batteries down, which meant most of the pre-fight announcements were missed. But at 8 o'clock, someone mildly said, "It's time, Miss Punk." She hooked the antenna wire into the screen and turned the knob. With a small amount of static, the fight was on. As the crowd listened, ignoring the bites of mosquitoes and the night bugs, Joe Louis defended his title. I remember the men jumping up and down, shadowboxing with each other. They gave step-by-step instructions as if they were coaches, and Joe Louis could hear each word. As they yelled and jumped, Ma Punk would occasionally throw out her warning, "Don't step on my flowers or I'll turn this darn thing off." Of course she never did, but for a while they were quieted until a victory punch for Joe was announced. The radio fight would go on into the night, too late for a little boy like me to hear its finish. I'd fall asleep on my cot by the window while the colored people of Glen Allen successfully coached their hero in another victory. So as you can see, they had a sense of identity with their local celebrities, and they felt that the success and achievements of one Black person whose name they knew was their achievement. And we still feel and do those things to this day. It's like Brother Bakari talks about, if one of us makes it, we all feel like we have vicariously made it. And that is something that the author has really captured in this book. Well, I'll be back later on today or tomorrow to read you chapters 4 and 5. Thank you very much for tuning in. And I want you to remember, every single thing that touches your life, whether it is religious, social, or political, must be an instrument of your liberation, or you must throw it into the ash can of history. Well, thanks for coming to hang out with me today. I appreciate each and every one of you. I'll be back soon. And remember, you can email me at revolutionarymatron@gmail.com if you have a book request, and I will honor that request to the best of my ability. You can also cash at me your request at rmatron through Cash App at $rmatron if you want me to respond. All right. Thank you very much, guys. Peace.